Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Manoj Singh and I head Ramco's business in North America. Welcome to this new edition of Ramco webinar. In some of the previous editions, we talked about some of the business challenges due to COVID 19 and what companies are doing to overcome those challenges. We call that recovery in aviation. We believe the worst is over, both at the pandemic level and the impact to the businesses. There are clear signs of recovery, but we believe the recovery is going to be as unpredictable as the COVID 19 itself was. Today, we will talk about what companies can do in terms of overall business and their supply chain configuration or reconfiguration to address those unpredictable recovery that is coming their way. With that said, I would like to introduce our panel guests for today's webinar who are joining me from Four Optics, a unique business and strategy consulting firm focused on aerospace and defense. My first guest is Seema Full, principal and managing partner at Four Optics. Seema is a seasoned supply chain transformation leader with over 25 years of hands-on experience covering high-tech, consumer goods, and aerospace and defense sector. She is proficient at aligning supply chain strategy with right processes and technology to yield value quickly. My second guest is Lynn Borek, managing partner at Four Optics. Lynn is a senior aerospace and defense executive with more than 20 years of expertise in strategic program and operations management, business development, and marketing, using creativity and vision to integrate complex systems to generate value for the end customer. Welcome, ladies.
Good morning, Manoj.
Good morning,
Good
Manoj.
morning. I'm really looking forward to some interesting conversation in this session. So before we get started, I would like to talk about, at least from our perspective, from Ramco's perspective, what we are seeing in the industry, in the aviation industry at large and aerospace and defense industry. We are clearly seeing that last year, when a lot of organizations like IATA and few other consulting organizations, when they talked about recovery, their forecast, their projection was that it may take all the way up to 2024 for the normalcy to return and the things to get back to normal in terms of demand and supply. Mm-hmm. But what we are seeing is clearly there is a unpredictable nature of the recovery coming our way. And a few of the data points that you see on the screen right now, in fact, one that is probably not there, I picked it up, I think yesterday, that United Airline has resumed heavy maintenance at many of their locations, and they, in the last 3 months to December 31st, they invested around $2 million in recovery preparation itself. We also see that companies like Lufthansa are starting to plan for the sharp recovery in their European business. Cargo, of course, has been the key driver in leading the recovery, and the online sales more than doubled since pandemic started, right? And a lot of companies have pivoted and diversified, taking advantage of this trend that has taken front stage in the recovery process. Other important development that happened last year, which is again continuing this year as well, is the business aviation. Business aviation saw the fastest turnaround in their business, and they spent a lot of time on bringing in new customer base into their portfolio. And the data shows that 96% of the new private jet travelers that came on board last year, they have remained with the companies, which means that they are continuing to drive further the business aviation growth, right? And then, of course, on other news that we saw, Delta is planning to bring back 400 pilots, again, in anticipation of what the recovery is going to be. So net, the whole, what we're seeing is, I think it's going to be swift and fast and unpredictable. So at this point of time, I would like to maybe turn it over to you, Lynn, to talk about from your perspective, from Four Optics perspective, while we're going to see some recovery happening quick and fast and maybe a little bit of unpredictable as well, what are the headwinds and challenges that you see from your perspective as we get into it?
Yeah, as you stated, Manoj, we're seeing a lot of really encouraging data lately. And it sounds very, very optimistic. However, there really are headwinds. When we think about recovery, we have to understand what we're recovering from. We're used to recovering from an economic downturn, and we are used to watching indicators to tell us when the market's coming back. What we're really dealing with here is safety of our passengers, safety of our executives on the airplane, and it's due to the pandemic, in addition to an economic downturn. And so it's not surprising to see business jets come back. When you think about what is causing that, it's to protect our executives, to keep them in a safe environment because they have to fly and fly often. In the aviation industry, the passenger issue still has yet to be fully defined of how do we keep our passengers safe. So by definition, we're seeing cargo come back, business jet come back, and the aviation passenger lagging behind significantly. And because of that, it has impacts on the infrastructure within aerospace. We do know that Airbus and Boeing are going to be pulling back on production. That's already been announced. We do feel very bullish in 22 and 23 that we're going to start the recovery and they will come back to the levels they were at, partially due to the Boeing issue on the 737 MAX, but also the passenger issue of how do we keep passengers safe, and do we really have to wait for the herd immunity to take place, or are there other things that can be done within the airplanes themselves? The heaviest impact that we've seen is really to the A&D suppliers and the infrastructure within the OEMs, primarily caused by the OEMs themselves and the delay in the demands. Seema and I have been out working with a lot of these suppliers over the last 2 years, and I will tell you that most of them are up and producing and staying stable. What they're missing is the demand signal from the OEMs. There was a huge delay caused by everybody working from home, and now there's a lot of slowness through that process to get the POs approved and the purchases done, and to get the suppliers back on their standing on their own two legs. And so we see a lot of the OEMs shifting to managing risk within the suppliers. The narrow body market over the wide body market was already taking over. We know that. We've seen a lot of the updates that are happening within Boeing and Airbus. That is going to continue and get probably more pronounced than we expected. And that's because we have fewer passengers and we need to fly more often. The drops in the operating margin focuses us all down on stability, predictability, all the things that we'll talk to you about in a minute about the supply chain. Global air travel dropped, probably the largest drop we've ever seen. It is going to recover, and it is recovering. We've got to remember that it has a long ways to go to get back to where it was. But every day we're seeing numbers, as you mentioned, Manoj, that are very, very promising. So, when we think about what the emphasis of all of the supply chain and the OEMs really become is predictable and managing risk. There's a lot of risk in this supply chain. So if we go to the next chart, you'll see that shift starting to happen. We were always very, very focused on reducing costs. We will remain focused on reducing costs, but flexibility and risk management become key now in this new environment. So I'll hand it off to Seema to talk about what we're seeing.
Thank you, Lynn. Manoj, when you started the discussion with the unpredictability being unprecedented, I think you hit the nail on the head. It is unprecedented and it will remain unprecedented. So that's why, there's two ways of dealing with unpredictability. Either you keep trying to predict it, this can't be predicted. So therefore, you change your own behavior, you change your own ability to respond. So if you think about it in the manufacturing process, right? If you can't predict the demand, you make the cycle time for the manufacturing process so short that you can very quickly respond to uncertainty. And that same principle applies here as well as we think about these integrated supply chains. So as you see from this study, flexibility and improving the resilience in a supply chain is top of mind for most executives. And what's really important is how they're going about doing it, right? They're going about focusing on their suppliers and improving that collaboration with their suppliers and really understanding what they need to meet the needs of this unprecedented uncertainty that we have in the marketplace. No longer are we, it's still happening, but the smart supply chain leaders are no longer just beating up the suppliers. Okay? So
Yeah,
that's
I think
really important to notice here.
no, this is very interesting. I think what we're seeing on this chart, and this is not just I think we saying, but I think some of the large consulting organizations are picking on this topic as well, which is supply chain always used to be about reducing cost, optimization, right, and looking at both within an inter organization, which is still the case in the sense you have to look beyond the boundary wall of your organization. But I think the focus is clearly changing to reconfigure your supply chain in a way that improves the flexibility and resiliency of the supply chain and not just the cost aspect of it. I guess that's what I'm reading from
Yeah.
this chart, right?
Exactly. So the resilience of a supply chain is very important factor of our discussion today, because if we can make our supply chains more resilient, then we have a better chance at this unprecedented uncertainty that we're faced with. And as we move forward, we can capture growth opportunities because we're resilient. And Lynn will go into that a little bit later, because there's two parts to this value that's created, right? So if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about, what does this mean from supply chain perspective? So there are a few things that we're seeing with our clients and the market at large that is really actually quite interesting, but it's something we would expect, and many elements are a bit unexpected, right? So that's sign of the times. But one of the things that we're seeing, as we talked about, companies reaching out to their suppliers, companies reaching out to their, even sub-tier suppliers, they're creating logically integrated supply chains. So what that means is they're not under the same corporate headship, but for all intents and purposes, they are truly integrated. So if you think about the old days, that you, Lynn, and I have lived through, although we were just children at that time, there used to be vertical integration, right? Vertical integration was the thing to do, and that's how you controlled your supply chain. However, those days of vertical integration kind of, they still exist, but most of the vertical integration was replaced with globalization. So these tiers went further away from us. What we're seeing now is actually that vertical integration is needed, but doesn't have to be under the same corporate structure. So these organizations are creating these logically integrated supply chains so that you have a true focus on that supply chain and you treat them as one logical entity. So that requires a very robust digital footprint, and it enables a truly resilient supply chain. So that's one piece we're seeing. And then another piece that we're seeing, which is fundamental reconfiguration of the supply chain. So we're all familiar with centers of excellence, right? But typically we think about centers of excellence as a way of optimizing manufacturing. Well, it's really interesting. Centers of excellence are actually very meaningful and provide a lot of value when we think about them outside the context of manufacturing, where we think about planning, design, procurement, distribution, and create those centers of excellence with these logically integrated supply chain. You actually get collaborative competition. So what you end up doing is you end up pooling that aspect of demand and aspect of supply, and you get better leverage out there, not only from a negotiation perspective, but you also cut the cost out of the supply chain. But it requires very different behavior. So one of the things that Lynn and I are working on with our clients is how to think about that and how to reimagine that center of excellence concept so that you can really now, even if you're a small player, you have the power of the 800-pound gorilla, right? And then the final piece that we're seeing, and it's very, and I think we're going to see a lot of that in 2021, is the M&A activity. So one of the things that we have found is that, of course, we've all known that a lot of the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers are really the bottleneck in the supply chain in many cases, because that's where the greatest risk is for an OEM. What we're seeing is that these as a result of the COVID-19 impact, many of these folks need help to survive and to thrive. So there's a lot of M&A activity around these sub-tiers, and that's creating another opportunity. That's creating an opportunity for demand and supply to be pooled, but then it also creating an opportunity for business growth. So what we're seeing is as these sub-tiers are being purchased, they're being held as wholly owned subsidiaries. So they're no longer getting, sort of sucked in by the OEM, and they become just for that part of the OEM. They're actually they're being created as an opportunity for additional OEMs to collaborate around this particular opportunity. And I think we can say more on this than I.
One of the things that we need to remember is that this tier that we're talking about is diversified and has been for a very long time. They've been a part of aerospace, but they've also been a part of medical and industrial and several other markets. The OEMs are starting to realize that they can't destroy that value and they have to keep the portfolios balanced. They also realize that if they become the owner, the other aerospace companies are going to shy away from them because of the IP protection as well as the competition. What we're finding is most of that tier is learning how to manage the IP and knows how to partition the work, either by facility or within the system, and they can protect their customers. So this friendly competition that we're talking about really is taking hold, and most of our systems, when we've digitized, we've allowed for that capability inside that tier supplier. And so everyone's starting to realize that you can't destroy the value when you acquire it, but you need it as close to you as possible to ensure a quicker turnaround in the development of products. And so you've got to figure out how to keep them working within the markets that they're in and keep them viable going forward.
Those are excellent points, I think, ladies. And I will say one thing that they're also kind of tying into each other. For example, the whole concept of pooling of demand, that is possible only if a center of excellence, an organization that has been acquired by an OEM, right? That entity has the level of independence to be able to tap into the demand from other OEMs or other customers as well. That's the only way they can actually pool the demand. And I think everyone benefits from that perspective. They're able to pool the demand and create that larger demand signal back to the suppliers that they are working with, and be able to sort of get the whole economy of scale as well as the volume discount aspect of it, right? So I think this is all coming together very well. Now, this is we wanted to sort of talk about what does it mean in real life. These are great, from a theory perspective. We will talk about some examples, but before we go there, I just wanted to see if there are any questions that are coming our way in this private chat, because we have people joining in from different places. And one question that has popped up, and I see that here as well, Peter Dimitri, is we have seen early retirements and tear downs last year. Yes, of course, a lot of parked aircraft led to the early retirements. And how good or bad is it? Has it affected the pooling providers, part suppliers, PMA? Very interesting questions. Very interesting questions. So I don't know if Lynn or Sima, do you want to take a first cut at answering this? I have my thoughts on this as well. Yeah.
Sure. This is one of the things that is causing the delay in the market recovery. Fact of the matter is, it is impacting us, and it is bad because it's slowing the recovery. We're parking airplanes, and actually, if you go all the way back, the airlines parked the airplanes at the maintenance cycle due date, and then picked up another aircraft and continued to fly. So that aircraft never even went into maintenance. It's sitting there waiting. The airlines are working through that to figure out at what point do they need to start maintenance and which airplanes are they going to permanently ground. The airlines are doing this with also another idea in mind, and that is to maintain their employees. So airlines are perfectly capable of doing some of their own maintenance, and they do not want to lay those people off because they drive the maintenance cycle for the airline. And so the airline will do their own maintenance until they saturate what they have, and then it'll come back out. That's one of the things that's causing the delay. The other thing is, to be really honest, we're canning airplanes. We haven't done that in a long time. we are actually parking them and taking parts off of them. That is going to cause a problem. And a lot of our MROs and the people that we're working with are actually acquiring those aircraft in order to get the inventory buildup that they need of the parts. So that's a big shift in this market. So it's kind of a good and bad, because it's giving us parts that we didn't have, that we were having to PMA. But it's slowing the recovery down on the MROs and the repair cycles.
Seema, do you have any take on this?
No, Lynn covered it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the only thing that I wanted to add to this is, I think this is one of those situations where these parked aircrafts and the tear downs that in the short term I believe will definitely create a spike in the availability from the supply perspective of those parts, which in any way is good, because that is where the whole technology that we were talking about, we will talk about in terms of how it is helping in terms of supply and demand balance. I think it can tap into that additional supply and then be able to do a much better job of optimizing the demand supply synchronization. I think I clearly see the value of that. Other thing that I see is that in long term, mid to long term, this will definitely create demand for newer aircraft because of the parking or the retirement of these aircraft, which means that business for OEMs, which also means that for overall for the aviation and aerospace industry, this would be a good news in long term.
Absolutely. I think that's the of it.
Good.
I think that's important, and that's something that we're very clear with our clients about, is don't just look at the next 2 years. You got to look at the next 8 to 9 years of what's likely to happen, and really adjust your growth strategy based on that.
And another thing to remember is that what's causing the parking of these aircraft of their efficiency. We now have very, very low fuel prices. And so that's going to the parking is going to be slowed because of that. But what we're seeing is a shift in the buying of the airlines, to your point, Manoj, to the very efficient airplanes, which are the 787s and the newer, the MAX and the NEOs, because they are providing that margin for the airlines. And so those production levels are going to come back up. We really believe that.
Okay, very good. Maybe we can move to the next slide where, I think we talked about some very interesting points in terms of the pooling of demand, pooling of supply. But the most important thing that we talked about was the center of excellence, the whole concept of center of excellence as applied to the ecosystem at large, and how the larger organizations that are creating this center of excellence through their own M&A activities can still try to behave logically as an integrated supply chain, right? So what we have found, and again, Seema, your input is welcome as well, but from our perspective, from Ramco's perspective, few tenets have emerged in terms of if you have to look at the supply chain and this center of excellence organizations or multiple organizations combined together, how do you still make them look logically as integrated supply chain, right? So one aspect of that is how do you create on both ends of these center of excellence a seamless integration with the customers on one end and suppliers on another. And seamless integration essentially means that all the different types of transactions, from purchase orders to shipments to invoicing, payment, all of that have to be as seamless and as zero touch as possible, right? Because you want to create the center of excellence. The very purpose of the center of excellence is to create efficiency, the pockets of efficiency, right? The pockets of efficiency that are going to come if you have hyper integration, end-to-end integration, and as much reduced manual touches and manual processes as possible. That's one part of it. And the other part of it, within this center of excellence, you want to infuse as much of intelligence through the latest technologies like AI, ML, and automation as possible. Again, going back to how do you make everything as efficient and effective as possible. Right. Any thoughts, Seema, on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head. If you think about it, the pieces that the automation, the enterprise integration, AI, zero touch operations, I look at those as the key components that you need to be able to execute on this strategy. So I look at it as 3 different layers. So the first layer is a process layer. You really have to lay out the right process and right capability from an organization perspective so that they know what this logically integrated supply chain looks like and what's the reimagined journey of this logically integrated supply chain. So that's the process layer. Then you layer on top of that the capability, the digital capability that you need on top of that, which includes all of the different elements we just talked about. And then there is a layer of organization. So then when you take a slice for each entity, you're giving them a full-baked solution that allows a fluency across that entire logically integrated supply chain. Where we see these types of things fail is when we don't prepare the organization, because this technology is very robust. That means any problem, anything that you want to achieve, you'll be able to achieve it very quickly. But then it also has the other end of it, which is you got to really know how to run this thing. So we got to, so the workflow piece of it is one thing that's very, very critical to this. So I think that, the technology elements, the process element, and the organization capability, when put together, you've got an incredibly robust capability that you put in the hands of these COEs.
Very nice. Good point, Seema. Looks like we have some really interesting questions coming from our audiences here. So this question says, this coming from Michael Armstrong.
Mhm.
Airlines will have surplus components for years. This will change the cost base, reduce repairs for 2-3 years, reduce the number of aircraft to become self-sufficient. How will this impact pooling? Interesting question. So I'll take my cut at it, and I think this is, the way at least I look at it, clearly, as in more surplus components come into the mix, this I think will improve the bargaining power of the players in the industry. I mean, pooling is all about these large MROs working with major airlines and trying to pool some of the inventory as part of their overall PBH agreement, right? So I think once some of these surplus become available in the market, I think it would be interesting for these large MROs to figure out a way to have their hands on these spares available in the market. Maybe they're the ones who actually take part in buying these aircrafts and being able to do all the tear down that needs to happen, and then going back to the airlines to have that agreement on the pooling from the long-term perspective, right? That's the way I think I see this shaping it out. What I don't see happening more is airlines tearing it down and sitting on those parts for a longer time, because if they do that, the only access they have to the demand is their own airline. Whereas as MROs do it, they can truly take the advantage of pooling and have multiple demand streams across multiple airlines. That's the way I look at it. I don't know if Seema or Lynn, you guys have any points to this.
Manoj, one of the things that we do see airlines doing as they're parking their aircraft is what we call guaranteed pooling, meaning that they gave them the asset and they're looking for a guaranteed of a pool. The other thing we need to remember with pooling is pooling and canning airplanes only works as long as those airplanes are still flying. The mix is changing. We have to remember that when we, and that's where Seema guards us every time. We got to look 3 years out. When we set our plans and we decide our infrastructure 3 years out, the mix of those aircraft that are going to be flying is entirely different than what we're flying today. So we kind of overreact because of what's happening right now. But in reality, this canning and pooling and all it did was solve a PMA problem, which quite frankly, I'm thrilled to see it go away. Most of us are. None of us can redesign old parts very well. We've all been trying to do additive manufacturing and blue scale scanning and all sorts of things in order to make it happen. But in reality, it's hard, it's expensive, it's time consuming, and it detracts our really great engineers when they could be working on new stuff. So quite frankly, I think the market's being helped by this because it gets that PMA piece away and it stops bogging down the engineering, which quite frankly is a scarce resource in aerospace and has been for quite some time. So the release of the engineers to start working on the new stuff is refreshing. We may actually see the recovery come quicker because of that. And that's kind of, I mean, how do you turn lemons into lemonade? But I really do think it's positive.
Yeah, I agree. I think the long-term view, we always have to keep the long-term view on this because, and I think that what this does is it gives you the ability to pivot as you need to. If you did not have this capability, so the pooling piece actually helps you helps you stay agile as your demand shifts on you and as the mix changes on you.
Yep.
Great point. Great point. Before we go to the next slide or set of slide, which is all about giving a real life example of the things that we talked about in terms of center of excellence and the efficiencies around it, we will take one more very interesting question that has come, which is maybe we should flash that. Again, from the same gentleman, I believe. What are your thoughts on the predictive maintenance becoming mainstream in 2021? Will it play a major role in redefining inventory strategies? This is actually a great question. I would see maybe Seema and Lynn, if you guys have any thoughts, because I feel very passionate about this whole predictive maintenance, but I will let you guys take the first cut and then I will respond back.
I think Lynn is as passionate as you are, so I'll let Lynn take it.
Not only am I passionate about predictive maintenance, I am passionate about that airplane telling me what it needs now, real time through data link, and warn me what's coming before it lands. I mean, all of us want to get to that world. I think this is always going to be important. It is absolutely the future that we're all seeking. And predictive maintenance remains very, very, very important. It may slow a little bit because we are now doing maintenance by bringing an airplane back online. But I don't see it going away. It's critical to getting the last, big cost out of the system because it begins to tell us where to position parts, how to position parts, and quite frankly, that aircraft really is its own best piece of information possible. So if it can monitor itself and tell us where we're at, and we can have the algorithms on the ground to say, oh, by the way, I think it's going to ping us here pretty quick. That's a positive change in the environment. And I don't think that is ever going to go away, that emphasis. I think we're all passionate about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think from a supply chain perspective, I think we're going to look back and say, how do we ever live without it? Because if you think about the planning that, what goes into the planning today, there's like averages of averages to averages, right? And so we know that doesn't get us anywhere. So, but that's the best we've had. So by enabling this capability and really bringing it to mainstream, I think is really, really key to supply chain optimization. So not only does it help from a parts availability perspective and getting the maintenance done quickly, but working capital, cash. This directly translates into a company's bottom line, in company's cash flow. So I think you're going to find that this concept is going to be very, very important to supply chains and C-suite.
Yeah. And the only thing that I would add to that is maybe taking a further step back, right? There's so much of reliance on OEM-driven manuals and maintenance programs that even after 30 years in service for an aircraft, they're still relying on those OEM manuals. And what so much has changed and happened to that aircraft in those 30 years, right? So I think that shift is going to happen. I think it's not about this or that. It's about in the overall life cycle of an aircraft. I think clearly the OEM provided manuals for maintenance are going to have a lot of relevance in the beginning part of the aircraft. But as the aircraft goes through its journey, through its life, that relevance will go down, taper down. And what will become more relevant is the historical data that gets built up, that gets used by this AI/ML driven predictive maintenance. That will drive primarily what I call as optimized maintenance plans, not just based on the hours and cycle, but truly based on the utilization of those aircraft in the environment. And hopefully that will drive optimized inventory planning as well as the demand profile changes. And to your point, Lynn, I think this real-time IoT sensors based information feeding back, that actually brings another whole new dimension to the planning in terms of what I call as the micro planning, right? A pre-AOG situation that before the actual breakdown happens, through these sensors, we're able to do a micro planning, a very near short-term planning, and have the inventory at the right place at the right time, right? And not waiting for the AOG to happen. So,
well, and one of the pieces of information we've never had that we will have when we get to this new world is how does that airplane operate in different environments? We think we know, but we don't because it's not talking to us. We have a lot of folks that are flying over in Asia that are experiencing all sorts of different maintenance issues than we experience in North America. And getting that airplane to continue to talk to us just tightens that up.
absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so I think we should move on to the next set of slides. Now, this is really our what I call as, we talked about the concept, the center of excellence, right? We talked about the pooling of demand, pooling of supply, and the efficiency of these center of excellence. What I wanted to talk about in the next, this and the next couple of slides is really an example, live example of what we have done it in reality. So what you are seeing is a very familiar picture that I think all of us are, have known for quite some time. On the top part of the slide is a spaghetti of demand and supply, right? And each point-to-point connections, highly inefficient way of looking at the pooled supply and pooled demand, which, by the way, doesn't even exist in the upper picture up there, right? Whereas if you look at it from the concept of the center of excellence applied to this model, so just to give you a context, right? So AMP is a company that is primarily into supply of parts on the consumables and consumable side, and their genesis lied in the fact that they were the outsourced procurement arm of a large MRO organization here in the US, and and uh, and they were given enough independence that over a period of time they have brought in more customers. So, and they have deployed Ramco to be able to create this whole end-to-end integrated supply chain. So they actually are able to pool the demand across multiple customers, their original MRO customer, and then now the more that they have acquired, and then they are connected to their customers through our integration with Aero Exchange on one end. And then what they do is once all these demand signals or the POs that come into AMP or the Ramco ERP of AMP, we pretty much take those signals seamlessly into the system without any human intervention, or I should say minimal human intervention. And then we have infused this whole intelligence through the process where the system looks at the pool supply base and essentially the performance of suppliers, the real-time availability of the parts at those suppliers, and then it makes a dynamic decision on procurement of which part from which supplier. And this is like not just one or two, there are hundreds of those decisions being made on a daily basis. And then there's a PO flip happens, PO coming from customers flipped into based on that intelligence into PO for suppliers. Suppliers receive that information through again the connection with Aero Exchange. So that's where the whole end-to-end integration comes in. And once suppliers have shipped the part either directly to the customers or through AMP, all that advance ship notice and shipment signals come back into Ramco. Invoice comes back into Ramco through these end-to-end across all these transactions. All the three-way and four-way matching happens, and the payment happens pretty much touchless as well. Of course, there are some thresholds that are defined that if the dollar value is beyond a particular threshold, then it goes for an approval and process. But other than that, majority of the flow that happens from the PO all the way to shipment, invoice, the whole code to cash across multiple enterprises is very seamless and touchless, I would say. So that's one example of, I think, how the center of excellence, in this particular case, procurement, has been enabled in the real life.
Yeah, right? And that's exactly the types of synergies that we expect to see, and we tend to see in other case studies as well. So, I think having the zero touch process, having an organization that it's a self-learning model that starts to, uses AI and ML to really make those tweaks in those plans on an ongoing basis.
Absolutely. So there's one more question that actually ties to the previous point that we were discussing. Maybe I think we should just answer this since it has come. And the question says, to what extent is AI and ML helping in forecasting the demand and market status? So I think, we kind of answered this question in our previous, just a few minutes back, but clearly AIML is proving its worth in terms of being able to predict the forecast, to a great degree of certainty. That's clearly, I think, is visible. But it is more than just the demand forecasting. It's also about the intelligence that AIML brings in terms of every aspect of the demand supply synchronization that we talked about, right? Being able to automate a lot of different processes, being able to pick the right supplier through the historical performance of those suppliers, and then being able to close the loop with the forecasted demand. It's the complete picture where AIML comes and helps us.
Yeah, and I think, and I would just take it one step further. I think when we think about, the fact of the matter is, if Manoj, Lynn, and I could predict the market, we probably wouldn't be sitting here doing this, right? We'd be protected by a lot of security too, right? So the end goal is not to necessarily try to predict the market, but the end goal is to be resilient so that you can very quickly respond to the changes in the marketplace. So AI, ML help you understand those patterns, help you understand what's happening so you can dynamically make changes. There's another element of this, which is understanding the risk of your supply chain. This is where AI, ML also plays. And so it's not necessarily just the forward looking, it's understanding historically the behavior of your supply chain in certain conditions and be able to say, if those conditions coming, and that's really where the geopolitical issue, information flows in as well, right? So we've never had tariffs, but we've also had disruptions in the Southeast before, right? We get snow in Chicago every year, right? So there's these patterns of behaviors that AI, ML help us sort of get a grasp on. And then we say, how does that map to the geopolitical conditions that I'm coming at? Now, tell me where my risk is so that I can place my demand with my partners who are going to be less risky. And that's what we're really creating. That's the resilient supply chain that you're creating, and not so much focusing on the getting precision out of your forecasting model.
That's a good point, because you think about where we're at right now. We've never had COVID before. Well, we had 911. 911 was a catastrophic impact to the aerospace market. We've had an economic downturn before. We can bring those in to get those macroeconomic looks, and then we can begin to monitor it. And that's really where we dial it in. This is about dialing it in. We can, all of us sitting here, the three of us, have been involved in bringing those models together to say what we think are going to happen in a predictive type way. But then the data starts coming in every day, and you got to dial it. And that's what this allows us to do. It allows us to give everybody indicators across the market and how it's impacting at both the top level, the bottom level, the commodity level, all of it, and put it together in a meaningful way to take action.
Good, very good. I think time for one more question here from the audience. I think we can take this, which says, you have talked about optimization, but in many organizations, key departments, planning, purchasing, maintenance are in silos. So what is the way forward for them? I think this is something very interesting question.
Yeah.
I'll let one of you guys take this one on.
Yeah. I can take the first shot, Lynn, and then you chime in. I think this is very near and dear to my heart because, again, Manoj, I think you'll agree, we can throw all the technology at the client, but if we don't change fundamental behaviors of that client, the technology can only go so far, right? So the idea here is when we talked about that 3-layer cake for resilience, that layer around process and that layer around organizational capability and creating the organizational fluency is very, very important, because you're not going to just simply take the silos you have today and put a layer of technology on it and voila, all of a sudden it works. It doesn't work that way. So the first thing we do, this is where we differ, right, is that when we think about this, because we've all been practitioners, is that we really take a step back and say, what do I want this organization to do? What are the behaviors that I want this organization to have? Therefore, what do those new processes look like? What do those new metrics look like? What do those new motivating factors look like for this organization? And then we layer in the right technology that, as Manoj mentioned, from a Ramco perspective, they have the capability and the technology. And when you hook it with the right processes and organizational capability, you get phenomenal results from those and phenomenal value from that implementation versus the old days of the ERP days, right? We're dating myself back in the 90s when we all implemented ERP systems, right? And it was like, go, 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 just implement this. And all of a sudden you're going to come out on the other end much better. And we learned our lesson. That didn't happen because we didn't change the processes and we didn't change our behaviors.
And one of the key fundamentals of For Optics when we go out to work with our clients is sales and operating plan coordination. So it's more than planning, purchasing, and manufacturing. Imagine if you could focus your sales team to not just go out and win anything, but win the right things. What if you were to tell them to go off and go ahead and pick up that contract because that takes care of my factory absorption rate? We have to be able to signal each other. We have to work with precision, but you have to take it even farther than operations. An organization that is connected end to end and can signal each other from end to end, which we can now do using these digital systems that we have, starts working with very, very clear precision all the way to the portfolio balancing and the new business. And that's what we want, because we want both an impact on revenue and we want an impact on EBITDA. And the only way we're going to get that is if all of these functions begin to work together in precision, almost like a machine, and you got to signal each other. That's what all of these digital systems are about, creating workbenches, setting priorities, all the way back to the business development and sales team, and all the way forward to the shipping team. It has to be that way because that's how we get that movement of dollars through our system.
Makes sense. And since Seema, you talked about the value that will come from this optimization or interconnection of the center of excellences. So I wanted to talk about. So I gave the example of AMP as to what has been done. There's a slide that we have here that talks about the business value that they have received from this whole implementation. So if you go to the next slide, you will see the business value. This is huge, and this is, I think, all blessed by the customer as well. The context here is that this company, through the acquisition of multiple customers, has gone in their revenue 10x increase in their overall business in just 2 or 3 years time frame, right? And they could not increase their costs, or they prevented, and they did not want to increase their costs linearly, otherwise that would have defeated the very purpose of that growth, right? So that's where the center of excellence, the efficiency that was brought in with Ramco implementation comes into picture. And the examples of that is the material requisition coming from the mechanics on the ground to converting that into the PO request. 80% of that is completely automated. Nobody touches those requests, right? Those goes into PO requests, and then 84% of those PO requests convert into PO through, again, an auto supplier selection that I talked about, which is the system looking at the past performance of those suppliers and the availability of the parts, and then converts that into the PO for suppliers, almost 84% without any touch, which is huge in terms of savings. Yeah. So they started, I believe, with a very small procurement organization, around 10 plus people when they started the whole organization. And I think the number has only gone up by a couple of more people, while their business has grown tenfold. This is huge. And all because of the automation that you see, that the metrics here, right? Similarly, the 88% automation in their goods receipt process. And that is important because that's where, and the good receipt and the invoicing is important, because all the 3-way and 4-way matching that the system does, pretty much all automatic. And only when there's a threshold violation, then it goes for approval. Otherwise, all the payments everything happens in a very auto fashion. And we're talking about hundreds of these POs, invoice, receipts happening on a daily basis, right? That's the kind of zero touch process that we have achieved. And of course, like I mentioned, this company has grown 10x, and that's the aim that I think people need to have in this today's business, right? They need to look at whether their business growth and the consequent the use of technology for the efficiency, and they should aim at 10x improvement in their metrics. And clearly we have seen that happening in the context of AMP.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Manoj, because we see that as well. It's kind of interesting when we tell our prospects, real client metrics, whereas we've improved expanded EBITDA by 200%. It's like, well, that's unbelievable. How did you guys do that? Or we improved inventory turns by 5x, or right? The idea here is that these are not incremental things. This is not continuous improvement. This really is transformational. So you really do take bold steps in how you run your business, and you think outside the context that you've created today, and you force yourself to go outside of that comfort zone. And so, yes, you absolutely get these types of results. Lynn and I kind of chat about it, and we're like, gosh, how do we tell them that yes, this is the possibility. This is the art of the possible, that you really can get to these types of results.
Yeah, it's breakthrough. And we've talked about this for years. We've been accepting incremental change through lean, and you certainly get it. There's no doubt you can get it by putting some of the digital systems. Seema mentioned SAP. We got an incremental step. We're not talking incremental anymore. We're talking true breakthrough technology and true breakthrough reset of the way we work. And it is phenomenal, the amount of results that we're getting. And to Manoj's point, the kind of throughput that we're getting with very little increase in cost, additional staff, additional inventory we have to carry, it's amazing. And that's how you get these 10x results. And I think we need to change what we expect out of ourselves in the future because of it. This is possible. Our strategy plans 3 years out need to fundamentally change what we expect from ourselves.
Exactly.
Okay, so I think we are probably ready to wrap up this. We have 7 minutes to go. We will probably go to our last, I believe, slide, where I think Seema or Lynn, one of you can talk about the key takeaways, and if there are any more questions here from the audience. Okay, Seema, maybe you could go.
Sure, thank you. So, we've talked about a lot of different elements, but I think there's a theme here, right? So the theme here is our top focus for most supply chain leaders is resilient supply chain. And if it's not, it should be. Because if you think you can predict the market, you shouldn't be a VP of supply chain. You should really be out on Wall Street, right? So the idea here is to really think about what will it take to create resiliency in your supply chain. And it's no longer just about the four walls of an organization. That resilience starts from the customer signal all the way back to the sub-tier suppliers. And that type of a logically integrated supply chains are emerging. Manoj just walked us through a concrete example of a COE that is, and in fact, that COE isn't even created by M&A. None of those entities are still wholly owned entities within themselves. They've created a logical supply chain, which makes a lot of sense for that particular business. So if you're an OEM and you're out there looking at your sub-tiers, that's a great opportunity for you. That's a great opportunity for you to create that logically integrated supply chain. It's also a great opportunity for you to now have a vehicle for business growth. Okay. And then the final piece around the digital enablers, AI-driven automation, intelligence, enterprise integration, all of those are key enablers for us to be able to make the COEs and the logically integrated supply chain successful. And all of those need to be wrapped around a robust process that is self-learning process and is enabling an informed organization. I always talk about creating analytical fluency in an organization. You have to create digital and analytical fluency in an organization of the future. I think sometimes people say, well, does that mean this technology is going to put people out of jobs? Absolutely not. This is going to make those redundant, non-value-added activities, take those out of the ways of your staff so they can actually be more efficient. They can actually be focusing on the strategy pieces that they need to focus on. They can quickly, no longer are they chasing data to understand where their risk is. They can actually be going out there and mitigating that risk before it stops a shipment for you. Okay, so with that, I don't know, Lynn, if you have anything to add to that?
Now let's go to questions.
Manoj, you're on mute.
That's the most famous, I guess, the line, right? You are on mute.
You're on mute, yeah.
Okay, there's one more question that I think we probably have time for only one. So after disruption of supply chain due to COVID, do you think operators will move away from just-in-time inventory models to storing right-size inventory?
No.
I'll take Lynn. Maybe you can take. I think you already have.
What we just talked about to get to 10x. There is no way they can. They are not going to stockpile inventory. Just in time becomes as important, if not more important, in this new world. Being able to pull from you based on real-time demand system is becoming more and more and more critical. So no, I don't see them doing that. I do see them doubling up on suppliers. They may buy from you and someone else because they're managing their risk. As we pointed out, that's being able to have a resilient supply base that I can 100% count on, no matter if we have a snowstorm or a tornado or an earthquake, or you fail to perform. I've got to be able to hit my deliveries. And as you guys have all noticed over the last, 5 years, Boeing and Airbus are very serious about that. If you don't hit your deliveries, you get to write them a check. So just in time going away, it's not going to go away.
Yeah. And my take on that is, I think, going back to what I was telling earlier, right? I think it's only gonna come into a different form in the sense that when you have all these sensors, IoT devices tied to the aircraft, and you have a real-time signal of their operations, I think you have now much better way of managing those just-in-time inventories, right? Because unlike in the manufacturing world of automotive, where you know exactly what the schedule is, and hence you have all these just-in-time inventories, that's not the case in the world of aviation, right? But you want to go towards that, and how do you go towards that is trying to get signals as real time as possible, and then be able to analyze those signals and be ready with the inventory before the aircraft on ground, the AOG situation happens. So it's going to take its own form, driven by some of these IoT and other technologies that are coming into play.
And one of the ways the OEMs are incentivizing you to accept their just-in-time brilliant idea is to make you hold the inventory. So you want to keep your costs of inventory down. You're going to accept the signals through the system.
Yeah. And I think the way I see it is that, what you just said, Manoj, that we finally have the right technology tools to truly get the value of JIT, right? The concept of JIT was all about having just the right amount of inventory when you need it, and not stockpile a bunch of safety stock that's going to become obsolete over time, right? So the idea here is now enabling every partner in that supply chain with the tools and with the capability so that you can truly take that inventory out of the entire extended supply chain, rather than just beating up your suppliers and their sub-tiers and their sub-tiers. Because guess what? When you did that, the cost came back to you anyway. Yeah. Right? It came back to you in price rather than in inventory. So this is truly taking cost out of the supply chain.
I know we are almost there in terms of meeting our time, and only when the whole the conversation is getting even more interesting, huh? We talked about this whole replacing inventory with information, 10 years, 20 years back, and now we are talking about completely replacing or changing your business model and having this center of excellence, and replacing and having this the information, the speed, the enterprise and integration, all that as the enabler to minimize the inventory, optimize the inventory across the whole value chain. Huge improvement, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so these are very interesting topics, but unfortunately we have to go. We are at the top of the hour for this webinar, and I think we can probably bring that slide again where we had the information of myself, Seema, and Len. So again, thank you everyone who joined this webinar. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure Seema and Lynn, you guys did as well. And if anyone has any questions, you can always reach out to us at these email of ours that is mentioned on the slide. Any last word, last thoughts, Seema, Lynn?
Let's go make the supply chains resilient.
Yeah, this industry needs help to recover, so let's all roll our sleeves up. And thanks for all of you that I'm watching my phone right now are already asking questions. So feel free to reach out. We absolutely would love to talk to you.
All right. Thank you again. Thank you very much, Seema and Lynn, for joining me in this webinar. And thank you all the audiences for joining us as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manoj.
Bye-bye.